while the American ghost ship Mary Celeste remains a legendary tale of a crew vanishing at sea, a far more chilling mystery occurred off the Scottish coast, not on a drifting vessel, but inside an impenetrable stone fortress. 3 experienced keepers completely evaporated from a securely locked lighthouse, leaving no trace behind except an eerie, undisturbed silence. What followed was an investigation that captured the public's imagination, raising dark questions about the terrifying power of isolation and the unforgiving nature of the ocean. Hello, and welcome to the channel. To fully grasp the chilling magnitude of what transpired, one must first understand the terrifying geographical isolation of the Flannan Isles. Situated over 20 miles off the remote west coast of the Isle of Lewis in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, this small, rugged archipelago is a brutal, unforgiving cluster of rocks jutting violently out of the wild North Atlantic. For centuries, these islands remained utterly uninhabited, known only to passing fishermen, seabirds, and local highland legends that deemed the jagged, windswept shores cursed. However, at the twilight of the 19th century, the Northern Lighthouse Board recognized a critical need to guide the increasing volume of transatlantic shipping safely past these treacherous maritime hazards. The solution was the construction of the Alien Moor Lighthouse, which was finally completed in 1899 after years of grueling labor. Erecting a structure on a rock completely exposed to the open ocean was an extraordinary feat of logistics. Materials had to be hauled up steep, slippery cliffs that plummeted directly into the churning waters below. When finished, it stood as a towering 75-foot beacon of heavy stone, brick, and iron, anchored firmly to the highest point of the island, bringing the light's elevation to nearly 200 feet above sea level. At the time, British engineering was riding a wave of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. The architects and officials who commissioned this structure believed it to be entirely invincible. It was a monolithic fortress featuring exceptionally thick walls, a marvel of mechanical precision, and a symbol of man's triumph over the elements, designed specifically to withstand the most violent furies of Mother Nature without sustaining a single scratch. Operating such a deeply remote and vital outpost required men of exceptional physical resilience and unquestionable psychological discipline. The Northern Lighthouse Board did not employ amateurs, nor did they tolerate negligence. The keepers assigned to Alien Moor were seasoned, highly trained professionals, men who had spent their entire lives battling the volatile Scottish weather and were deeply accustomed to the strict, quasi-military regulations of lighthouse keeping. The protocol dictated that 4 men were assigned to a station, with 3 men on duty at the lighthouse and 1 taking his rotation on the mainland, relying solely on visual flag signals to communicate with passing ships in the bitter winter of December 1900. The 3-man team stationed on the island consisted of individuals whose experience left no room for careless mistakes. Leading the crew was Principal Keeper James Ducat, a 43-year-old veteran with over 20 years of impeccable service. Ducat was known for his fastidious attention to detail, a devoted family man who strictly adhered to the rulebook. Serving alongside him was Second Assistant Thomas Marshall, 28 years old, who, despite his younger age, had already proven himself highly capable and dependable on several demanding offshore assignments. The third member of the crew was Donald MacArthur, a 40-year-old occasional keeper. MacArthur was a tough, battle-hardened seafarer who had stepped in to cover for the first assistant keeper, William Ross, who was away on sick leave. Together, they formed a highly efficient, rigorously disciplined unit. They were intimately familiar with the lethal dangers of their profession, trained to follow safety protocols without exception, and knew exactly how to survive in a deeply hostile environment cut off from the rest of the world. These were practical men who understood the ocean's unpredictable temper, yet they also possessed the unshakable Victorian confidence in the impenetrable shelter of their modern lighthouse. They stepped onto the island with absolute faith in those stone walls, but the sea always has its own rules. On the bleak morning of December 26, 1900, the relief ship Hesperus finally carved its way through the heavy, grey swells toward the unforgiving Flannan Isles. Captain Jim Harvey stood firmly at the helm, his face weathered by the exhaustion of battling relentless, punishing winter gales that had delayed their arrival by several long, agonizing days. The ship was tasked with delivering vital fresh provisions and transporting the relief keeper, Joseph Moore, who was anxiously waiting to swap places with one of the men on the rock. A routine exchange that should have been nothing more than standard procedure. However, as the Hesperus drew closer to the formidable, jagged silhouette of alien Moore, a creeping, inexplicable sense of unease began to settle over the crew. Standard maritime protocol strictly dictated that the keepers should have hoisted a prominent flag to acknowledge the approaching vessel, signaling to the mainland crew that the station was secure and prepared for docking. Yet, as the men peered through their spyglasses, the towering flagstaff remained entirely bare, standing like a stark skeletal needle against the oppressive overcast sky. Hoping it was merely a minor oversight, Captain Harvey ordered the ship's powerful steam siren to be sounded. The deafening, mechanical blast shattered the oceanic stillness, echoing violently against the steep, unforgiving cliff faces. The sailors lined the deck, their eyes straining through the biting, salty wind, expecting to see the familiar dark silhouettes of Ducat, Marshall, or MacArthur emerging onto the path to wave them in. They waited in tense silence, but the only response to the ship's desperate call was the mournful, piercing cries of a massive flock of startled seagulls circling nervously overhead. The landing platform below was completely deserted, entirely devoid of the empty provision boxes that should have been meticulously staged and ready for transport back to the mainland. A profound, suffocating dread, heavier than the winter fog, washed over the men aboard the Hesperus. Sensing that something was deeply wrong, Harvey dropped anchor in the choppy waters and ordered a small rowboat to be immediately lowered. Relief keeper Joseph Moore, accompanied by a few anxious sailors, climbed over the side, rowing fiercely through the freezing surf toward the island's rocky edge. With every rhythmic pull of the oars, the unnatural, heavy stillness of the island seemed to amplify, pressing down on them. Disembarking onto the slippery, algae-covered stones, Moore called out the names of his colleagues, his voice quickly swallowed by the roar of the crashing waves. Receiving no answer, he began the long, arduous ascent up the narrow stone stairs carved directly into the steep cliffside. The climb was physically grueling, consisting of over 160 steps winding upward toward the base of the towering lighthouse. Here, the pacing of the world seemed to violently slow down. The men moved with agonizing caution, their heavy, waterlogged boots scraping against the cold, damp rock in a slow, reluctant march. The usual, comforting signs of life, the faint smell of pipe tobacco drifting in the wind, the rhythmic hum of the light's machinery. The distant chatter of men going about their daily maintenance chores were entirely absent. Finally reaching the top of the dizzying precipice, Moore stood alone before the heavy entrance compound. The iron gate leading into the courtyard was firmly shut, exactly as it should be to keep out the elements. He pushed past it, his breath visibly pluming in the freezing air, and approached the main entrance door of the lighthouse itself. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his knuckles turning white, a deep-seated instinct warning him of what he might find. Slowly, he raised his hand and pushed against the thick, heavy wood. The hinges let out a dry, prolonged creak that seemed to echo endlessly through the circular stone hallway, sounding almost like a final warning. As the heavy door swung inward, it did not reveal a chaotic scene of violence, nor did it offer a warm greeting from the missing keepers. Instead, Moore was met with an impenetrable, suffocating void. The air inside was stale, cold, and entirely undisturbed. An unnatural, terrifying silence hung over the empty rooms, a silence so profound and absolute that it chilled the blood of the hardened sailors more effectively than the biting Atlantic wind ever could. As Joseph Moore and the sailors from the Hesperus cautiously advanced into the living quarters, they were met with an atmosphere of suspended animation. The heavy outer entrance gate was securely closed to the elements exactly as it should be, yet the internal doors were left entirely unbolted, swinging slightly on their hinges to suggest a sudden, unplanned departure rather than a routine exit. The men meticulously moved from room to room, their lanterns casting long, distorted shadows against the curved stone walls. There were no signs of a physical struggle, no overturned furniture, and no bloodstains to indicate any sort of foul play. Instead, the domestic scene spoke volumes through its eerie normalcy, an ordinary day that had been violently interrupted. In the sleeping quarters, the heavy woolen blankets on the beds were unmade and tossed aside, looking precisely as if the men had hastily risen from their rest. The fire in the grate had long since burned out, leaving nothing but a mound of cold, grey ash. Yet, most haunting of all was the large brass wall clock ticking in the main living area, or rather the stark lack of its rhythmic sound. The pendulum hung dead and motionless. In a profession where every duty, every logbook entry, and every shift rotation was governed by precise timekeeping, allowing the station's clock to run down and stop was an unthinkable lapse in discipline. It meant that no one had been alive or present inside the alien Moore lighthouse to wind its heavy gears for several days. Time, for these three men, had completely frozen. Searching for any written explanation, Moore desperately checked the station's logbook and the slate, but found nothing that could rationalize the current emptiness. However, as the search party moved toward the entrance hall, a small, dimly lit vestibule where the keepers meticulously stored their protective weather gear, they stumbled upon the most confounding and chilling clue of the entire mystery. On the heavy brass pegs lining the cold stone wall, the men inspected the remaining foul-weather clothing. 2 complete sets of thick, waterproof oilskins, along with their matching heavy sea boots, were missing. These belonged to the 43-year-old principal keeper, James Ducat, and his 28-year-old second assistant, Thomas Marshall. Their absence made logical sense. It indicated that the 2 men had deliberately suited up to brave the treacherous weather outside. But it was the 3rd peg that sent a cold shiver down Moore's spine. The 3rd set of oilskins, the heavy weatherproof coat belonging to the 40-year-old occasional keeper, Donald MacArthur, was still resting perfectly untouched on its hook. His heavy sea boots remained neatly placed on the stone floor beneath it. To a layman, a forgotten coat might seem a trivial detail, but to the experienced seafarers standing in that silent hallway, it was a glaring, terrifying impossibility. Donald MacArthur was not an inexperienced landsman. He was a tough, battle-hardened Scottish sailor who had spent his entire life navigating the lethal, freezing waters of the North Atlantic. He knew better than anyone the deadly consequences of exposure. Under the strict, unwavering regulations of the Northern Lighthouse Board, stepping out onto the exposed cliffs of the Flannan Isles during a raging winter gale without proper protective attire was not just a severe violation of safety protocols. It was a definitive death sentence. The freezing sea spray, the hurricane-force winds, and the rapidly plummeting temperatures would have incapacitated a grown man within a matter of minutes. For a veteran keeper of MacArthur's caliber to deliberately abandon his heavy oilskins, leaving his only protection behind in the dry warmth of the lighthouse while he rushed out into the teeth of a violent storm, defied every ingrained survival instinct he possessed. It contradicted years of disciplined, quasi-military training. It was a wildly irrational, desperate act from a man known for his practical, steady nature. What could have possibly possessed him? What apocalyptic event could he have witnessed from the safety of the lighthouse windows? Or what desperate, blood-curdling cry could he have heard over the deafening roar of the ocean that demanded such immediate, unthinking action? The situation outside must have been so sudden, so instantaneously catastrophic, that the mere seconds required to pull a heavy coat from a peg were deemed far too costly. The profound, undisturbed silence of the scene soon gave way to wild, sensational rumors back on the mainland. But what the official investigators would eventually uncover out on the jagged cliffs was far more terrifying than any ghost story. When a profound mystery lacks an immediate, logical explanation, human imagination eagerly steps in to fill the terrifying void. In the decades that followed the disappearance, sensationalist 20th century media, alongside writers like Vincent Hayes and various romantic poets, spun wild, gothic tales that deeply embedded themselves into the public consciousness. These exaggerated, dramatic accounts painted a macabre and theatrical picture of the final moments inside the alien Moor lighthouse. They spoke of half-eaten meals left hastily on the dining table, chairs knocked to the floor, and forks still sticking out of cold, untouched meat. They whispered of a fabricated, highly emotional final logbook entry, describing seasoned sailors crying, losing their minds, and desperately praying to God as an unnatural, demonic storm battered the stone walls. These embellishments made for fantastic ghost stories, capturing the public's morbid curiosity, but they were entirely, unequivocally fictional. The stark reality of the situation, meticulously documented by Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, was far less theatrical but infinitely more perplexing. Muirhead was not just a distant bureaucrat. He was the man who had personally recruited James Ducat and knew the missing crew members well. Arriving on the island on December 29th to conduct the official investigation, he was a pragmatic professional who relied strictly on empirical evidence, and his comprehensive report systematically dismantled these pervasive urban legends. When he examined the living quarters, he found absolutely no abandoned meals or signs of sudden indoor panic. The kitchen was impeccably tidy, the pots were properly put away, and the dishes had been washed, dried, and neatly stacked. This pristine condition firmly indicated that whatever tragedy befell the three keepers, it occurred well after they had finished their normal domestic routine and cleared the table. Furthermore, Muirhead's examination of the genuine, official logbook revealed no frantic scribblings about weeping or madness. The entries were completely standard, reflecting the mundane professionalism of the crew. The slate contained routine notes regarding the barometric pressure, wind direction, and sea conditions. The final, perfectly normal entry had been meticulously recorded on the morning of Saturday, December 15th, detailing the passing of a heavy storm. There was no poetry, no desperate prayers, and no descent into insanity. Just the clinical observations of men doing their job right up until the very end. The interior of the lighthouse had yielded nothing but mundane perfection, acting as a silent, frustrating dead end to the investigation. However, when Superintendent Muirhead shifted his attention from the sheltered, undisturbed confines of the living quarters to the brutal, exposed cliffs of the island's exterior, the narrative drastically and violently shifted. The focus of the investigation moved to the West Landing, a narrow, treacherous platform carved directly into the rock face, primarily used for hauling heavy supplies up from the relief boats. This platform sat precariously high above the churning Atlantic, situated a full 110 feet above standard sea level, seemingly well out of reach of even the most aggressive tidal activity. It was here, upon the unforgiving precipice of the West Landing, that Muirhead discovered the true, terrifying scale of the violence that had struck Alien Moor. The scene was one of absolute, catastrophic destruction. Heavy iron railings, designed specifically by Victorian engineers to withstand the harshest maritime conditions the Atlantic could offer, were violently twisted and bent completely out of shape. A massive wooden supply box, previously secured tightly in a deep crevice roughly 100 feet above the water, had been smashed into splintered fragments, its heavy contents scattered carelessly across the jagged rocks. Even more alarmingly, the thick, heavy-duty ropes used for the station's crane had been forcefully ripped from their heavy iron moorings, and a block of stone weighing over a ton had been visibly displaced. This was not the work of a phantom, nor was it the result of a sudden madness among the crew. The catastrophic damage at the West Landing pointed to a physical force of utterly incomprehensible, staggering magnitude, a force so immensely powerful it defied standard maritime logic and hinted at a nightmare born entirely from the dark, freezing depths. Faced with the sheer, unprecedented devastation at the West Landing, Superintendent Robert Muirhead was finally able to piece together the tragic, logical sequence of events that transpired on that fateful Saturday, December 15th, 1900. In his official, meticulously detailed report submitted to the Northern Lighthouse Board, he firmly concluded that the three men had not fallen victim to madness, supernatural entities, or foul play, but rather to an overwhelmingly catastrophic act of nature. He determined that the keepers had been struck by what oceanographers now refer to as a freak wave or rogue wave, a sudden, exceptionally large, and highly unpredictable wall of water that can rise violently out of an otherwise manageable sea. Piecing together the scattered physical evidence and the strict operational protocols of the station, Muirhead constructed a terrifyingly plausible timeline of their final moments. As the severe winter gale began to aggressively lash against the Alien Moor cliffs that afternoon, Principal Keeper James Ducat and Second Assistant Thomas Marshall recognized the immediate threat to the station's heavy equipment. Acting with the disciplined responsibility expected of their rank, the two men dutifully donned their heavy waterproof oilskins and thick sea boots, stepping out into the biting tempest to secure the exposed supply boxes, heavy mooring ropes, and the crucial lifting crane situated precariously at the west landing. Meanwhile, the 40-year-old occasional keeper, Donald MacArthur, remained inside the reinforced safety of the lighthouse, likely stationed high up in the watchtower to monitor the worsening conditions. From this elevated vantage point, peering through the rain-streaked glass, MacArthur would have had a sweeping, unencumbered view of the violently churning Atlantic horizon. Suddenly, the seasoned mariner must have witnessed something so entirely unprecedented and immensely horrifying approaching from the deep water that it completely shattered his rigid composure. Driven by an overwhelming, desperate instinct to warn his vulnerable colleagues below, MacArthur sprinted down the winding stone stairs, completely ignoring his heavy weather gear hanging in the vestibule, and burst through the outer doors in his shirt sleeves into the freezing gale. The sheer, unadulterated panic required to force a veteran sailor to abandon his survival gear speaks to the apocalyptic scale of the incoming threat. Before MacArthur could reach Ducat and Marshall, or perhaps just as he desperately shouted his warning over the deafening roar of the wind, the monstrous anomaly of nature struck the island. A freak wave, estimated to be dozens of meters high, surged violently upward from the dark depths, ignoring the natural boundaries of the jagged coastline. Rogue waves of this magnitude do not break gently like normal surf. They are sheer walls of solid water moving, with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train. It slammed directly into the steep face of the cliff with the destructive force of a detonating bomb, easily cresting the 110-foot elevation of the west landing. In a fraction of a second, the colossal wall of crushing, freezing water completely engulfed the heavy iron railings, the secured wooden crates, and the three helpless men standing on the exposed rock. The devastating power of the rogue wave ripped the heavy crane ropes from their iron moorings and effortlessly peeled the keepers from the stone surface, dragging them instantly into the violent, swirling abyss below. There was no prolonged struggle, no time for heroic rescues, and no possibility of surviving the crushing, icy impact. In the mere blink of an eye, the ocean reclaimed its terrifying dominance, sweeping three seasoned lives into the cold, dark expanse of the North Atlantic, leaving behind nothing but a silent, impenetrable stone fortress and a mystery that would haunt the maritime world for over a century. The tragedy of Alien Moor stands as a stark, humbling reminder of humanity's inherent fragility in the face of the natural world. The late Victorian era was defined by a soaring belief in industrial supremacy, driven by an arrogant conviction that mankind could easily tame the wildest frontiers by simply constructing massive, impenetrable fortresses of iron and heavy stone. Yet, the North Atlantic violently demonstrated that even our most formidable engineering marvels are ultimately powerless against the chaotic, untamed fury of the ocean. The Lighthouse survived the storm flawlessly, but the men tasked with keeping its light alive were swept away in an instant. Superintendent Robert Muirhead's conclusion of a devastating freak wave remains the most scientifically sound and widely accepted explanation for the sudden disappearance of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. It neatly accounts for the catastrophic physical destruction found at the West Landing and the highly illogical abandonment of MacArthur's weather gear. However, the deeply unsettling reality is that there were absolutely no surviving witnesses to corroborate this precise timeline, and not a single physical trace of the three men was ever recovered from the freezing waters. It leaves an agonizingly small, persistent shadow of a doubt in the minds of historians and maritime experts alike. Was Muirhead truly correct in his clinical deductive reasoning? Or does the real, terrifying truth of what happened that stormy December afternoon still lie undisturbed at the dark bottom of the ocean, forever guarded by the silent stone walls of the Flannan Isles? What are your thoughts on the official findings of the Northern Lighthouse Board? I invite you to share your own theories and perspectives down in the comments section below. If you appreciate this deep dive into historical mysteries, please consider leaving a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel so you never miss an upcoming investigation. For those who wish to support the production of these documentaries further, you can join me over on Patreon for exclusive, ad-free episodes. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again soon.